conscious disinformation is a huge feature of this movement. We really can't overestimate the degree to which a sector of the rank and file have been drawn into a sort of fact-free universe of propaganda. And movement leaders are doing this deliberately to separate from the facts and separate the rank and file from the facts, make them fearful, which makes them easier to control. And I describe some of these propaganda initiatives in detail in Money, Lies, and God.
Hello, and welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're looking at a phenomenon that we would have considered unimaginable until perhaps 2021. The development I'm referring to is a strange, multifaceted political movement inside America that's hell-bent about bringing the destruction of its own democratic system. Yes, you heard right. Not a movement from without, but a force from within the US, studiously working to turn Americans against their own chosen form of government, democracy. So who are these dark forces that have amorphously aligned to create a, quote, engine of unreason? This is the words of Katherine Stewart, and she's written a book on this topic. She's been investigating this new style of religion, some of whose members are not religious at all. In fact, they're comprised of several distinctly different constituencies, often with conflicting agendas, but they have combined into a hostile force, which is creating a constitutional crisis in the country. Katherine Stewart's a journalist who spent the past 15 years covering the intersection of faith and politics in America. This book, Money, Lies, and God, is her latest, and it's all about the rise of the religious right in America. Welcome, Katherine, for taking the time to join us today to talk about this.
Thank you so much. It's great to be in conversation with you today.
So you're currently on your book tour around the country. How's it going with this?
Well, the book launch is going well. Money, Lies, and God received amazing reviews, including the New York Times. It hit the New York Times bestseller list the week that it launched. But frankly, I wish the book had been less relevant. It's not like I didn't see this coming. I've been researching this movement for 16 years, but I hoped that when it came out, frankly, people would have been less interested because they'd be convinced that our country was going in a different direction. And I think a lot of people were frankly surprised by the outcome of the election because they've not been paying attention to the money that's been invested in the movement to destroy democracy, to the misinformation bubble that the money has funded, or to the networks that have been developed over time that are explicitly anti-democratic and want to destroy democracy.
So your first book, The Good News Club, was published in 2012, and it examined the religious right's effort to infiltrate public education. And it was piqued by the events at your own daughter's public school in California, where you started investigating the beginning of this outfit called the Good News Club that set up shop at the school, but in fact was the work of outsiders. So tell us a bit more about what you discovered.
Yes, my journey into this field started in a playground in Santa Barbara. And what I saw then really didn't make any sense. Good News Clubs are these fundamentalist indoctrination programs that install themselves in elementary schools targeting children in their very earliest years of learning, children who are too young to read. And some of the parents, our public school was in the same district as an evangelical college, Westmont College. And the Westmont College, listen, evangelicalism is actually fairly diverse in America. And a group of the evangelical parents at our school offered Good News Club leaders space for free in the church next door to the school, and they declined. And that really raised alarm bells. I thought, why do they need to be in our public school as opposed to the church? What did the people who ran the club really mean when they called our public schools their mission field? They were calling other people's children the harvest. What was this all about? So I followed this thread and found that the topic was much bigger than I imagined. The most important thing I've observed over time is just how much the Christian nationalist movement has evolved. I mean, the core ideology has really not changed, but its appeal and its strategy has broadened to a massive degree. And its influence over one of our two major political parties is really indisputable. I mean, at the time, I could see that the people who were running this Good News Clubs were pursuing an agenda that was profoundly at odds with American democracy. But I also could see, as I dug in deeper, that this movement, this organization was just one part of a much larger movement. It was a small component of a leadership-driven, organization-driven political machine. And they
So
were
tell me about the couple that were down the road at the estate, the huge estate, the Pepsi couple. What was their thinking in having an interest in this? What was the agenda essentially?
Thank you so much for the question. In Money Lies in God, I write about an initiative that's separate from Good News Clubs. It's one of the pastor initiatives that are intended to turn out the vote in conservative or conservative-leaning churches. So this is a couple that live down the road from us. They're an heir to the Pepsi fortune, not the heirs. There's numerous heirs to different features of that fortune, but these folks lived in, one of their houses. They put it on the market for, I think, something like $72 million. So we're talking people with a lot of money, an awful lot of money. And they were actually funding an initiative called Faith Wins, which draws conservative and conservative-leaning pastors into networks, and movement leaders and leaders of the Christian nationalist movement will go to churches and bring in local pastors, invite them to these gatherings, sometimes dozens or even hundreds. I went to one event where hundreds of pastors attended an event like this. And then they give them messaging and materials intending to get these people to turn out their congregations to vote for far-right candidates. Movement leaders know if you can get the pastors, who are the most trusted voices in their communities, you can get their congregations. And a lot of the power of the larger Christian nationalist movement is aimed at turning out the rank and file in disproportionate numbers.
And going back to the original little seed for this, so what would this club do that wasn't being taken care of in the school curriculum?
Well, they were targeting children with a message that if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to go to hell and you need to attend the right kind of church. And they were using kids attending the club to spread this sort of misinformation, this idea that the public school endorses a form of religion to recruit their peers. Now, here's the thing. Kids as young as 5 and 6 years old cannot make a distinction between an activity that's in their public school and one that is endorsed by their public schools, because public schools have a cloak of authority in the minds of young children especially, but even in the minds of the community. There are government institutions. So they think if something is being taught in their school by adults, it must be what their school wants them to believe. And we could see how divisive this group was in our own public school, where all of a sudden, people are fighting one another about the presence of such a divisive group in the school. And this sort of division, I realized, was not an unintended consequence of the activity. It was precisely the point. These groups and other groups that I describe in Money Lies in God, such as Moms for Liberty, they're intending to create this sort of conflict and division within public schools because, well, they've got two aims. The first aim is to force their own programming into the public schools and have turned public schools into sort of spreaders of religious nationalism, where there's this idea of an approved version of religion, and insiders versus outsiders, the pure versus the impure. So it's identity politics on the one hand. And second is that they want to foster mistrust in public schools in order to soften the ground for wholesale assault. This movement recognizes that an informed and educated public is the enemy of autocracy. So that's one of the reasons they are determined to smash public education as we know it and divert taxpayer money to private and religious schools that are free to spread far-right economic ideology as well as a kind of religious nationalist agenda.
A clarification, somebody's just written here. What does turnout in disproportionate numbers mean? Are they voting twice?
No, no, absolutely not. But in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't bother to vote, and an additional number of people have their votes sort of downgraded or stolen from them through race-based gerrymandering and other dirty tricks, not putting enough polling places in Black or disproportionately like Democratic-leaning districts. It doesn't take a majority to win elections. All it takes is a disproportionately mobilized minority that is turning out the vote. So there's an evangelical pollster named George Barna who identified the most sort of devoted religious right supporters. He said there's something like 10% of the population. But in 2016, I know he said something like 91% turned out to vote and 93% turned out to vote for Donald Trump. So if you can get these numbers of voters, you can really, especially if they're concentrated in swing districts and swing states, you can really dominate in election cycles.
Okay, so first of all, kudos to you for all the digging you did for this latest book, because it's a very investigative piece of journalism. But before we start to analyze who comprises these anti-democratic forces, why did you choose the title Money Lies in God?
Well, first, money is a huge part of the story, meaning that huge concentrations of wealth, upward concentrations at the tippy top of the economic ladder, have destabilized the political system. I mean, we have a segment of the ultra rich who are investing their fortunes in the destruction of our democracy. The oligarchs who are funding the movement are one faction of the larger movement, and they're pursuing what they believe to be in their interests. And look, in the short term, maybe some of these policies are going to be beneficial to their pocketbooks because we're going to have deregulation for their sometimes monopolistic or polluting businesses. The movement is also intending to hamper or destroy rights for the workforce, and they don't want an empowered workforce. But we should keep 2 points in mind. And then I'm going to go on to the other features of the title. I mean, these oligarchs depend on a huge portion of the population that are not going to benefit from their initiatives. And if they understood properly, they really wouldn't be doing it. A second part of the, a lot of people are going to be harmed by this. And that's where the lies fits in. Conscious disinformation is a huge feature of this movement. We really can't overestimate the degree to which a sector of the rank and file have been drawn into a sort of fact-free universe of propaganda. And movement leaders are doing this deliberately to separate from the facts and separate the rank and file from the facts, make them fearful, which makes them easier to control. And I described some of these propaganda initiatives in detail in Money Lies in God. So God, the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is religious nationalism or Christian nationalism. It serves as a rationalization strategy for so many movement leaders as well as the rank and file to justify their support for a transparently amoral leader. It really serves to unify the voters to, if you can get people to vote on 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote. So a lot of the messaging of this movement is intended to sort of hit home that messaging that abortion is the greatest moral evil of our time. And, the LGBT agenda represents the greatest threat to your rights, which it doesn't, but that's what they say. And so they sort of get people to vote on those issues. And sometimes, just want to say, sometimes they'll get people voting on a teeny tiny side issues that really affect a tiny number of people, but they make them be the issue of the day. They'll amplify this, and like every speaker will all of a sudden start talking about it in order to make people panic and vote a certain way. So like a lot of the way I do my research is I go to right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings because I know that you cannot know really what's happening in this movement unless you're in the room and hear what they're saying to one another. And in 2016, I was at a large gathering of movement activists. Every single speaker, maybe this is 2014, every single speaker got up and said, we've got to talk about transgender bathrooms. And I'm like, why? Is that a thing? Like, it just didn't make any sense to me. But what we've seen over and over. They do their message testing, they figure out the issues that are going to poll well or make people turn people into a panic or at least grab their attention. I think anything having to do with sex and sexuality is, it's like a shiny bauble, it sort of catches people's eye and they don't pay attention to the other stuff that's going on in the room. So all of a sudden, this is what they're talking about.
And of course, the money. These people have aligned themselves as you say, odd bedfellows. They almost have counter messaging in terms of some of them are absolutely non-religious, but they find themselves going to these rah religious kind of the greater good. It's almost like the moral majority that used to be around with Phyllis Schlafly. That's what it reminds me a lot of. That was back in Reagan's era. So I think we've all been a bit taken aback by the speed and force of the change of this movement. And it seems to be weaponizing its attacks on the common good. But you say we shouldn't be surprised. In the book, you say that the seeds of this anti-democratic movement actually began long before Trump announced his candidacy in 2015. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the movement long preceded Donald Trump, and it will outlast him, unfortunately. I would say the current iteration of what we're seeing today got a start in the late 1970s, early 1980s, with the rise of a movement called the New Right that frankly thought the Republican Party had gone too liberal, too soft on communism. They were also very upset by school desegregation, the women's rights movement, and other changes in society. And they were very upset about trends in religion, where you had the rise of some sort of more liberal or moderate theologians who were sort of the important religious voices of the day. And they began to invest in, long story short, they began to create and invest in the deep organizational infrastructure of the movement. They formed a whole lot of different groups like Heritage Foundation, Council for National Policy, and so many others, and started to, and over time, like that organizational infrastructure has become sort of the reason the movement has as much power as it does. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just digress for a little bit and talk about the Christian nationalist movement. Of course, as we know, like Christian nationalism, in the American context at least, involves a rejection of a series of liberal democratic norms, including equality, now democratic elections, pluralism, and the separation of church and state. But when we're talking about the movement itself, this is not just an ideology. It's a leadership-driven organization movement, and that organizations can actually be divided into categories. There are policies, I could throw out a few names, but this is by no means comprehensive, but just people might know some of these, recognize some of the names. So there are policy groups like the Family Research Council and the American Family Association, think tanks like Heritage or Acton Institute or the Claremont Institute, which is sort of on the New Right side, but there's a lot of Christian nationalism involved in it. There's a vast legal advocacy ecosystem. I don't know how many of you heard of the Alliance Defending Freedom or First Liberty or Liberty Council or the Federalist Society, which plays a really important role in developing and grooming right-wing legal talent. There are networking organizations like the Council for National Policy and the Ziklag Group and others that get members of the leadership on the same page. There are pastoral initiatives and networks like Faith Wins, which I describe in chapter 1 of Money Lies in God and Watchmen on the Wall and others. And then there's that vast disinformation sphere that reaches the rank and file. So Christian nationalism is in some ways a political process. It doesn't even necessarily involve a consistent set of beliefs. I think of it as similar to authoritarianism. It's something that happens to a political system rather than just a series of attitudes held by members of the rank and file.
Wow, you hit a lot of names of organizations there, Catherine. You really went speeding through them. I was trying to catch. I mean, obviously, I read about them in the book, but I think most people will be amazed by that. So
There's so many others.
So they're going to have to replay this if they want to look up some of those or be alerted to them, because I think it's very important that these things are on your radar. When you see messaging from things, from
Oh, yeah.
organizations, you need to link, join the dots and see who's really underwriting this and what is that connected with, connected with, connected with. So, okay, so I went back today and replayed a conversation we had with Kristen Kobes Demers back in 2021. She had written this book, Jesus and John Wayne, which then was telling us about how these, she said, group and cult had morphed. And now I'm thinking it's morphed quite significantly over the last 4 years. And sometimes religion has a minor role in it, it's almost invisible. So let's look at these odd bedfellows that have combined to form this anti-democratic movement, and they comprise this coalition. So talk us through, if you wouldn't mind, slowly, the 5 groups that you've identified loosely.
Thank you so much. Odd bedfellows indeed. They are
Mm.
swimming in the same headwaters, but there are some divisions. So let's talk about those 5 categories. First, in Money, Lies, and God, I pay very close attention to the money people, the funders. They are investing a portion of their fortunes in anti-democratic projects. And I'm thinking about people, throw out some more names here, like the Corkerys or Barryside or the Wilkes brothers, Tim Dunn. They're not any one type. Some are Catholic, some are evangelical, some are Jewish, some are frankly atheistic. Religiously, they're all over the place. But the one thing that they agree on is the need to crush liberalism and what they call the administrative state. And some of them are more motivated by cultural and religious ideas, and others are more just money people. It seems like all they really care about is increasing their fortunes. Then there's the thinkers. Many of them are affiliated with a group, a movement I call the New Right. It's like the new right. There was an old New Right in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And then several years ago, this group of, I would say, intellectuals of the movement began to identify themselves as a New Right as well. And technically, they aren't, I would say, on balance, quite what you'd call Christian nationalist. Some seem very nihilistic, and draw inspiration from political theorists associated with the Nazis. I'm not kidding. Carl Schmitt, he's a Nazi political theorist who was very vital to that historical development. Figures, looms large among many of these thinkers. Some seem frankly driven in some ways more by campus politics or political conflicts than anything else. It's really about power. And they're always criticizing liberal elites, as they call them, but they're really aiming to become a new elite. And they've actually played a critical role in bringing the funders together with the foot soldiers of the Christian nationalist movement. So the third category is the sergeants. If you're looking for people these are very political pathers. They're the ones who go to those faith winds and watchmen on the wall gatherings and turn out their congregations to vote. And sometimes they're organizing similar types of initiatives. And if you're looking for people who articulate Christian nationalism in its most extreme theocratic form, you're going to find them among the sergeants and, of course, the power players, which is the next category. So the power players are heads of the different features of that deep organizational infrastructure. I'm thinking about people like Ralph Reed, who heads up the Faith and Freedom Coalition, or Tony Perkins, who heads up the Family Research Council, which is a very important policy group, or Bob McEwen, who has a leading role in the Council for National Policy, which has a really strong purpose of getting the different organizational leaders on the same page. And the power players are often the ones calling the shots. Some, frankly, take more religion, I would say, more seriously than others. When you spend enough time observing people, you can kind of get a sense of who really believes what they're saying. and who's just doing it for political purposes. But we got to keep in mind that two things can be true at the same time. Some people truly believe they're doing what's righteous and they're following God's will, but they also can sort of recognize that it's good for their own bottom lines, their own pocketbooks. So they can be about imposing their values on the rest of society, but also about politics and power and money. And
And
then
the foot soldiers?
foot soldiers are, well, Christian nationalism is arguably the most important piece of the anti-democratic reaction because it motivates these foot soldiers. Many of them might not identify themselves as Christian nationalists, but with their actions, they're lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda.
You say the one thing that unites all these people commonly, this really took me back in this day and age, was a profound rejection of Enlightenment ideals on which the American Republic was founded. That was really horrifying to me. Many of them regard themselves, as you say, as the new right, but you say they are neither new or conservative. So do they have a doctrine? Do they have any kind of a dogma, these people?
Well, they promote the idea that the United States is founded not on any principles, but on a specific religion and cultural heritage. It's the idea that America is on the brink of an apocalypse owing to the rise of equality and what they call wokeness, or the radical left, which could mean anything they want it to be, anything that's not a sort of white conservative Christian sort of dominated, male-dominated idea. The idea that democracy won't be able to solve the problems of America. And so this idea, like, is that the rules don't apply anymore, and that creates a permission structure for a strongman, right? An authoritarian leader who puts himself above the law, who's going to seize the reins of power and scrap the rule of law in favor of an iron fist. So in some, it's the idea that democracy, in the sense of government, is representative of the people in its ideals, respecting individual rights in a pluralistic society. The idea of a government that holds these ideals doesn't work. So you need to smash it up and create an autocracy. And I hope I make clear in Money, Lies, and God that this is emphatically not the idea of Thomas Jefferson or Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and so many others who helped create America as we know it, or tried to create a more perfect union. These ideas are really anti-American. So, has America been perfect? No, but it was the first major state founded on an idea, not on a tradition, not on a specific heritage or religion. It's the idea that all people are created equal. It's the ideal of religious freedom, the ideals of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and the ideals that we should be, governed by laws that are deliberated in public and applied equally to all. The idea of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And again, these ideals have not been perfectly applied over time. There have been many regressive movements that have existed from America's founding. But at the same time, we've always had progressive movements in America. We had movements that sought to entrench the institution of slavery, but there were also progressive movements that worked to end it and eventually succeeded. That's just one example of so many others. There have been numerous other progressive movements that have sought to sort of create a more perfect union. And so those ideals of equality and pluralism, rule of law, and justice, working toward the moral arc of the universe bending toward justice, those ideals remain worth fighting for.
So what was it that Winston Churchill said about democracy being the worst form of government until we found a better one, or something like that? So someone's written a question here. How does this movement manage to misrepresent the religious beliefs of the founding fathers, whose beliefs were often more accurately aligned with founding father Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, and importantly, The Age of Reason?
Oh, I just love that question. I feel like every time we get to Thomas Paine, it's like a bell should ring somewhere and we should all jump up and shout. Thank you so much for that. They've done so largely by through the work of I would say, historical propagandists like David Barton. I wish I could see a show of hands in here, see how many of you have heard of him. He's the key right-wing Christian nationalist myth maker. He's published book after book talking about how America's founders were all Bible thumpers and, wanted to create America for a specific religious purpose and the like. He's invented quotes from the founders that never actually came from their mouths. He published a book called The Jefferson Lies, I think it was called. He published it with Thomas Nelson Publishing, which is a Christian conservative publishing house, and they had to withdraw it, a first in the history of this publishing house, because they discovered that it lacked matters of fact, and it was so riddled with errors that they actually withdrew it from publication.
Another question: has the country had fundamentally anti-democratic movements like this at other points in history?
Again, thank you for the question. There have always been reactionary movements, movements that sought to, I would say, consolidate unjust power in our country. There was actually an earlier movement of Christian nationalism that was, whose founder or key person was a guy named Gerald Smith. And it was a sort of white Protestant nativism, this idea of America as a, conservative Christian nation whose laws should be based on a very reactionary interpretation of the Bible. I think about the pro-slavery theologians like Robert Louis Dabney or James Henley Thornwell, who argued in defense of slavery from a religious standpoint. And they were also allied with the sort of moneyed slaveholders, and they were very opposed to Reconstruction. But at the same time, we've also had these progressive movements in the power worshipers. I think I describe about a dozen plus pastors who argued for the end of slavery. And they also used their interpretation of sacred texts to argue for equality and justice. And how were they received by the defenders of slavery, the religious defenders of slavery? Well, they called them heretics, they called them atheists, they called them amoral, and they said, you've got these atheists and amoral people on one side, and God and the established, what's the term is something like ordered, God's established order on the other side. And the language is fantastic because you could hear that kind of language being echoed today. So there really is a through line in these reactionary movements. There's also a through line in the progressive movements as well.
Interesting. What role, if any, do the tech billionaires from Silicon Valley play in the new right?
Well, that's a really great question. Peter Thiel is one of the, broligarchs, as they call him, and he has played a sort of critical role in the new right. And then you can even hear people like Elon Musk, which we could do a whole thing on him, which we won't do right now. But recently I saw some tweet or something where he referenced he called it the woke mind virus or something like that. He used language that was very similar to what a fellow who's been very influential in the rise of the new right used, called it the woke mind virus. A guy named Curtis Yarvin, who argued
that again, Curtis
Yarvin. I write about him in Money, Lies, and God. He's had a very important perch at the Claremont Institute. He's contributed to them numerous occasions. Claremont Institute is one of these think tanks that sort of has powered the rise of the new right, or helped to power the rise of the new right. And these ideas that democracy doesn't work anymore because of equality. And, we're facing an apocalypse, this terrible threat, a globalist Borg, this sort of woke elite, which is really a kind of opposition to the principle of equality and pluralism. And the idea that this creates such a terrible threat that the rules don't apply anymore. And Curtis Yarvin and others have spoken about the need for a more monarchical form of governance. And some of them have actually talked about how we need a red Caesar, meaning a red, dictator. So you're getting this kind of articulation of these ideas from some of the thinkers of the new right, and it is also translating to some of the funders.
So I can tell how concerned people are. Good, ordinary people are very concerned because over 500 people signed up for this today. And we've got tons of questions here. And some of them are from people in the Episcopal Church. One's from a clergy member. Does white Christian nationalists engage with others who may not share their views? How might the more liberal churches fight the movement, engage just as citizens and try to organize our churches to push back?
Thank you so much for that great question. You know, there are a number of different organizations and individuals trying to reach messaging within churches, including not just moderate and liberal churches, but also within some of the more conservative or mixed populations. I'm going to throw out just a few names here because there are too many to be comprehensive, but I think about the Baptist Joint Committee and Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Amanda Tyler from the Baptist Joint Committee has written a wonderful book about this, and many other thinkers have written wonderful books about fighting religious nationalism from a faith-based perspective. I'm thinking about people like, Dumais, Christian Kobes Dumais, and Jamar Tisby, and so many others. There's folks like Caleb Campbell who are actually trying to reach people who've sort of fallen down that rabbit hole and draw them out of it. The thing about the religious, I would say moderate liberal left, is it exists, and it's really a network, by the way, which is, coming from the more Catholic side. They're not the equivalent of the religious right because they don't have the money and they don't have the organizational capacity. But here's what they do have. Number one, I think most American Christians see their religion as having something to do with loving their neighbor and caring for the least of these. And you can tell what a threat this interpretation of the faith is to the religious right by listening to their leaders. So recently I attended America Fest in Phoenix, Arizona. It was 20,000 hardcore MAGA supporters organized by Turning Point USA. And the head of Turning Point USA Faith, a guy named Lucas Miles, he's the head of their clerical and church outreach initiative. He spoke on several occasions, and he has a book titled something like Woke Jesus, the heresy destroying the Christian church, or something like that. And he said, I've made it my mission to eradicate wokeism from the American pulpit. What counts as wokeism? Well, he specifically spoke about the social gospel and grouped it together with liberation theology. He even took aim at the "he gets us" ads. Do you guys, any of you see the Super Bowl? You know, the sort of "he gets us" as a sort of soft evangelistic, Jesus, he gets us. He actually took aim at that. He said, is this is like he criticized it. And he said that sort of heresy of progressive Christianity started to enter the church in the 17th century. 17th century, think about that. And he said he's forming a new Nicene Creed and Council with 3,500 other pastors that are going to basically set the doctrines of what real Christianity is. And we all know the religion is incredibly diverse, but the fact that he's specifically taking aim at moderate, liberal, progressive Christianity with such force shows what a threat they believe that it is. So I think that sort of it's important to reach different populations with different messaging, but faith-based movements to sort of oppose the politics of, conquest and domination.
And hatred, really, hatred.
Yeah.
So let's move out of the church just for a second, because there's so many more areas of the book to look at. I mean, I know we don't want to get into the ins and outs of the arrests, the illegal arrests that have been made and seem to be increasing because, we don't know what these people's status is, et cetera, et cetera. However, what we do know is that last Friday, one particular person an academic in New York, had this group of people arrive on his doorstep. It was videoed, so a lot of people saw it. And his wife, who's 9 months pregnant, said it felt like a kidnapping because the officers were in plain clothes. They refused to show us a warrant. They refused to let us speak with an attorney or even give us their names. They forced my husband into an unmarked car and took him away. So I guess my question is this the new face of fascism?
It's clear that the movement wants absolute power. And we can see this in the first months of the second Trump administration. Every move they're making is really intended to give Trump as much power as he can have at his fingertips. And, that's like the sort of arrest without
Any
I,
due
setting
process? No
setting
due
aside,
process. Yeah.
setting aside the details of the various arrests, and there have been a few, and I think they're all done on a different basis, we can also observe that they're trying to destroy centers of information and knowledge at different universities and within the NIH. And why are they trying to do that? I mean, modern democracy relies not just on rules, but on also, and the rule of law, which is being violated, but also on specialized knowledge. It relies on expertise. It relies on rational accountability to function. I think Trump's people understand intuitively that this kind of rationality is inimical to their efforts to gain power. So they've really set about destroying these centers of expertise within government, and they're attacking it within educational institutions. And they have continued, of course, to lie and spread disinformation as vigorously as possible. I think very simply, they understand that the truth is their enemy.
I also think that this climate of fear is huge. They're stoking this climate of fear. So, just for everyone's information, if you haven't come across this, Joe Wright, who's the film director that made Atonement and Churchill's War, has just made an 8-part series about Mussolini and the rise of fascism. It's just about to come to American, one of the channels on television. He said his goal was to understand the seduction of fascism, why so many people fell for the message, and then why so many here are falling for a similar message. And he defined fascism, I thought was the best definition I've ever come across, as an assault of toxic masculinity. Is that not the most brilliant definition you've ever heard? So you've gone to a lot of these kind of political events. Would you agree with that definition?
Well, this is a movement that does advocate for a strict gender order. And I think it's worth noting that throughout history and around the world, male supremacy has supplied the backbone of authoritarian movements of many kinds. Fascist parties always glorify the virtues of manliness, by which they typically mean some sort of brutality. And they despise the weakness of what they see as womanliness, which is how they interpret empathy or moderation or compromise. They appeal also to the anxieties of the disempowered, and they promise to dominate objects of resentment, which can include, of course, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, and for a great many people happen to be women, or at least empowered women, or women who don't stay in their lane, and therefore who are easily blamed for all manner of social ills. So I think it's very interesting that
Um,
when you're looking at authoritarian leaders around the world, people like Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran, right? The sort of idea of male supremacy or the traditional valorization of a certain type of family is really critical for them. But they're also doing, they exploit, the exploitation of religion is also like a common theme. These leaders, are bubble wrapping themselves in sanctimony, as Trump has done. When he goes to his rallies, he's got a pastor to his right and a pastor to his left. You can't touch me. I got the holy men on my side. This is exactly what they do around the world in different religions as well. And they're doing it not to create a pure theocracy. I mean, their countries might be theocratic in a certain fake sense, right? But they're more accurately described as cronyistic kleptocracies, right? With absolute suppression of free speech and political opposition, a kind of control over the population. And yeah, gender hierarchy is part of that, but it's only one part.
Chris Hedges had a good interview, which I also would encourage people to watch on Upfront. And he said democracy no longer exists in the United States. And you wrote in your book, by the second decade of the 21st century, capitalism had yielded to a form of oligarchy. Are they winning, the oligarchs?
Well, I think it's important to note something about the funders, sort of setting aside Chris Hedges' analysis and opinions. I mean, the important thing to stress here is that the deeper motivations of these wealthy people are not always reasonable or rational. And this process is actually making them less reasonable. In many instances, it's also based on fear. Now, to be sure, they want their tax cuts and they do want to remove government oversight from their monopolistic and, in some cases, antisocial or environmental destroying businesses. But at the same time, they're also seeking certain types of protections, government protections. So there's definitely some narrow self-interest involved. But what I found is that they actually have often deeper and more neurotic motivations for what they do. After all, they don't need to make more money. They're seeking validation and legitimation for their own perceptions of self-worth. They're extremely sensitive to the largely valid criticisms that so much wealth concentrated at the tippy top of the economic ladder is not good for society overall. It's parasitic. Much of it is unearned. And it's destroying life for so many of the ordinary people in America. So they're extremely fearful that the people are going to come after them one day with proverbial pitchforks, so to speak. And I think these psychological anxieties have led them to make a really bad bet. They're betting that the destruction of democracy is going to advance their interests in the long term. I think, frankly, they're making the same stupid bet that the steel and chemical industrialists, for example, made in their dealings with the Nazis. In the end, it didn't work out very well for them either, or anybody else. I mean, I think there's one more thing I just want to say about this. I mean, I think that one of the main psychological hazards of extreme wealth is that these people live in almost like silos or islands. They're surrounded by yes people who affirm them in every way imaginable, even though from somewhere outside the gate or over the walls, they can hear the angry shouts of critics. So they're trapped in the kind of information hole. It makes them more extreme over time. I mean, it's beyond obvious at this point, but Elon Musk is a kind of poster child for this kind of adverse development.
Somebody's written another question here. Is it necessary for authoritarian movements to have the backing of billionaires and the wealthiest? Are they the backbone of this kind of movement?
Well, it's certainly true in this context. If we're looking at different authoritarian movements around the world and throughout history, I think we're looking at sort of a really rich and incredibly diverse group of movements. But we've seen this happen in different contexts over time.
Okay, so today in the Tyee, which is a Canadian publication, there was a commentary, and I'll just read you. There's a question at the end of it. Depressing as it is, one can understand the attraction that Trump holds for the opportunists and the grafters and the grifters that populate his circle. They ride his coattails for personal gain. What is truly disheartening is the continuing allegiance of a large segment of the American public. 58 days into the reign, with chaos enveloping the nation and stock markets plunging, 46% of Americans apparently still applaud him. Trump and his followers constitute an assault against normalcy. There is in America today a deep desire for the very disorder that he fuels and feeds upon. How can this be? How can this be?
I think it's hard to explain the extent to which a significant percent of the voting public has been drawn into a fact-free universe. And I know this is like, I just want to tell you a story, okay? Something that happened to me yesterday. I'm chatting with a lady who was telling me that she moved from a blue state to a red state. And I asked her why, and she said she was really concerned about what was happening in the public schools. And I said, what's happening in your public schools? The lady has two young kids, 2 and 5. And she said that they're letting the students behave like cats and dogs. They've ordered litter boxes for the school. So this is one of the right-wing things that they say. Kids are identifying as furries and meowing to their teachers instead of responding to the question. And this is something that you see all the time on, right-wing media. And I explained to her, which is sad but true. I mean, it's really tragic. The reason some schools are ordering litter boxes, not all of them, but some of them, is because if there's a school shooting event and you need to lock the kindergartners or second graders in the classroom because it's not safe to go outside, they need to have somewhere to go to the bathroom. So some schools have responded by, okay, this is a solution. It's part of our shooter drill. We got to have something for the kindergartners so they don't have to go. I mean, it's just horrifying. Gun violence is the largest source of death among children and adolescents in America, and it's absolutely disgraceful. And instead of taking that on, the right finds this thing that schools are trying, some schools, not all schools, just a few schools are really just trying to do to deal with it, with the threat, and amplifies it and turns it into some wild-eyed conspiracy. And one thinks, how could anybody believe in this? But if you're reading it every day on Telegram and your local parent group is telling you, you're getting this stuff on Facebook and you're watching Fox News every night, it's really hard to get through to that kind of disinformation. So, this lady I met, she seems like a nice person. She seems like she loves her kids. She cares about her community. She, really, we chatted some more and she talked about, I don't know, the importance of, some other things, but she's just been drawn to this fact-free information sphere. And when you try and bring in other facts, you're one voice, and yet she's hearing this message over and over every night. I heard this same kind of thing happen when I went to Reawaken America. Again, I wish I could see a show of hands if any of you know what Reawaken America is. It's a kind of traveling pro-conspiracist MAGA roadshow. They do these presentations in mega churches all around the country. Each event draws thousands of people. It's organized by some of Trump's most devoted supporters, people like Michael Flynn, and one of his kids usually shows up to speak, one of his sons, and Clay Clark, and so many, Roger Stone, who's been a sort of mentor, a mob boss who's been a mentor to Trump for decades. And you go to these places and you hear about the great conspiracy, the great replacement conspiracy, and you hear about 666 is emblazoned in the walls of, the National Institutes of Health or whatever, like crazy conspiracies, really violent rhetoric, creating the permission structure, I believe, for kind of political violence. I heard, Fauci should hang from a rope and we got to tie a rope with a millstone to his neck and things like, I mean, really stuff that is, I actually attended with a German documentary crew, and they were just shocked. They saw a guy wearing this T-shirt that said Blitzkrieg on it, and another guy with a T-shirt saying "Make men men again," and they were just like horrified. And they're like, we've seen this movie before, right? But the thing that these conspiracies, like all this conspiracism, is designed to confuse people, to make them fearful. They are going to come back to, in your public schools, they're going to change your gender against your will, or your children's gender. They're going to, even Donald Trump says your kids go to school, at 9 in the morning, they come back at 2, they're a different gender. What is he talking about? I mean, this kind of nonsense. The lie, of course, that the 2020 election was stolen. Everybody seems to believe it because they're told this over and over and over again. So you can't sort of disentangle the actions of the rank and file from this kind of disinformation, the lies that they're fed every day. But the lies are not coming from the rank and file. The lies are coming from the leadership of the movement and being spread by, these funded propaganda networks.
So this is very important. We're going to end on we only got 10 minutes, so we want to end on a positive note, if at all possible, in this quite depressing conversation. So you say the one thing about the movement is it's very strategic and it's well organized in the way that we Democrats, I should say, are not, the other party are not. You say we don't think strategically enough about messaging, about voter engagement and winning over the rank and file. So what are the suggestions you've got for your 6 principal findings and how we can kind of take a pro-democracy stance against this?
Thanks. I think a lot of us have gotten a little bit lazy about taking a society that has democratic ideals for granted.
Hmm.
Imagine that there is a sort of magic pendulum that's going to automatically swing in the other direction. We are the pendulum. There is no other pendulum. Nothing matters more as, than who turns out on election day. We have to remember that Trump won by, when you look at percentages by which presidents win their elections, Trump won by a really small margin compared with other presidents. I mean, Joe Biden won by a greater percentage in 2020 than Trump won in 2024. There was depressed enthusiasm on the Democratic side of the political aisle. And we have to, I remember Ralph Reed, he's one of the movement strategists, a key strategist of the movement. He said, pay no attention to the polls, our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And also a lot of speakers they're very tactical. Some of them know that Trump is imperfect, but they know if they can get the judges that they want, they can get a lot of the policies that they want. So in certain spaces, I've heard a lot of speakers say things like, we don't need a savior. We already have a savior in Jesus Christ. What we need is a leader. We need someone who's going to put judges into place. This election is about judges, judges, judges. So we would do well to heed not only their determination to turn out the vote, turn out the base of supporters, to stay unified, by the way. I think there have been a lot of efforts coming from the right as well as from hostile foreign powers to divide the sort of pro-democracy coalition. They find divisive issues, they push them, they get people upset and fighting one another. I think we really need to stay focused on the bigger prize. I mean, at the end of Money Lies in God, I have 6 pretty detailed suggestions about what to do. I don't have time to get into all of them here, but I do have time to summarize a few of them. So that speaks to, okay, so first of all, get off the couch. This is a time for moral courage. Get engaged in the fight. When they lost in 2020, they didn't just like slink away. They found new populations to evangelize with untruths, but more than that, they turned out their base. They went after low propensity voters. We need to do that too. Local elections really matter and local activism really matters. That's something everybody can do. If you don't pay attention to what's happening in your local school board, guess who's going to show up and take control? Moms for Liberty. We don't want that, right? We need to support pro-democracy organizations. There are so many of them. Do a little bit of research and find ones that sort of chimes with your interests and values. Here's another thing that sort of chimes with what I just said a little bit earlier. We need a big tent. We need to stop purity testing one another. We're not all going to agree on everything, and we shouldn't, frankly. Like a big, noisy family, you've got a lot of different interests. But if you can find more in common, we can agree on some core principles, democratic principles, like the principle of equality and pluralism, then we can work together, right? And a lot of the religious right gatherings I go to, I've heard speakers start talking about, they paraphrase Ronald Reagan, and they say, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. I think we would do well to sort of adhere to that too. And we need, to that end, to get a little better at spotting what the right is, how the right tries to divide us and pick our battles accordingly. Finally, I think it's really important to develop broad-based messaging and a broad-based coalition that sort of transcends the professional classes. It's really important to speak to the bread and butter issues that affect people on an everyday basis. I think we have an opportunity here. We're seeing people are losing their jobs. People are going to lose their health care, already starting to lose their health care. Prices of goods are going up because of needless trade wars. Our dearest friends overseas are abandoning us. This is really not making life better. A lot of projects that were actually the Build Back Better projects that were aimed at red states and providing jobs and security for people there have been terminated. Centers of expertise that like dealing with diseases are being impacted. And this is hurting real people, everyday people. And I think we really have an opportunity at this time to say, these are the people that did this to you. And here are the people fighting for you, and draw people into a more broad-based pro-democracy coalition.
Wow, we covered a lot there, Catherine. I think you gave us a little few pearls of optimism to leave with, which is always a good thing. And I would advise people to try and get a copy of the book to do their reading and networking. And if you can't afford it, then go get your library to order a copy or group buy in a book group. Okay, so thank you, Katherine Stewart, for your presence today and your diligent digging into all this, the very multifaceted arms of this issue. Very enlightening.
Thank you so much. Really great to speak with you, and thanks to all of you for tuning in today.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, Katherine.